Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of woman who noticed things others missed. At 42, she had developed an eye for detail through years of working as a social worker in downtown Chicago. But nothing could have prepared her for what she discovered on that cold December morning when she decided to take a shortcut through Lincoln Park on her way to work. The temperature had dropped to below freezing overnight, and a thin layer of frost covered the park benches and bare tree branches. Sarah pulled her coat tighter as she hurried along the winding path, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Most people would have stuck to the main sidewalks on such a bitter morning. But Sarah had learned that sometimes the most important discoveries happened when you ventured off the beaten path. As she rounded a corner near the old oak tree that marked the halfway point of her shortcut, something caught her eye. At first, it looked like a pile of discarded clothing or maybe some trash that had blown against the base of the tree. But as she got closer, Sarah realized with growing alarm that what she was seeing was a person. The figure was curled up in a tight ball, covered by what appeared to be a thin, tattered blanket. Snow had begun to accumulate on the edges of the makeshift covering, and Sarah could see that whoever was underneath had been there for quite some time. Her training kicked in immediately, and she approached carefully, calling out softly so as not to startle the person. "Hello? Are you okay? Do you need help?" There was no response. Sarah knelt down beside the figure and gently touched what she thought might be a shoulder. The person was ice cold, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought she might be too late. But then she felt the faintest movement, a barely perceptible rise and fall that told her the person was still breathing. With trembling fingers, Sarah carefully pulled back a corner of the blanket and found herself looking at a woman who appeared to be in her late 30s or early 40s. Her face was pale and drawn. Her lips had a bluish tint that Sarah recognized as a sign of hypothermia, and her dark hair was matted and dirty. But even in her current state, there was something striking about the woman's features, something that spoke of inner strength despite her obvious vulnerability. Sarah immediately pulled out her phone and dialed 911. While she waited for the ambulance to arrive, she did what she could to help the woman. She removed her own heavy winter coat and carefully draped it over the stranger, then sat down beside her and began talking in soothing tones, hoping that the sound of a human voice might somehow reach through whatever haze of cold and exhaustion had claimed her. "You're going to be okay," Sarah whispered, gently stroking the woman's forehead. "Help is coming. Just hang on for me, okay? My name is Sarah, and I'm going to make sure you get the help you need." The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing startling green eyes that seemed to focus on Sarah's face with surprising intensity. For just a moment, Sarah thought she saw recognition there, as if the woman was trying to communicate something important. But then, her eyes closed again, and she seemed to slip back into unconsciousness. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their red and white ambulance cutting through the quiet morning air with its urgent sirens. As they worked to stabilize the woman and prepare her for transport, Sarah provided what little information she could about how she had found her. The lead paramedic, a kind-faced man named David, thanked Sarah for her quick thinking. "You probably saved her life," he told her as they loaded the woman into the ambulance. "Another hour or two out here in these temperatures, and it would have been too late." Sarah rode with the woman to Chicago General Hospital, unable to shake the feeling that this encounter was somehow meant to happen. During the short ride, she learned from the paramedics that the woman had no identification, no purse, and nothing to indicate who she was or where she had come from. She was, for all practical purposes, a mystery. At the hospital, Sarah waited while the medical team worked to slowly warm the woman's body temperature and address what appeared to be severe dehydration and malnutrition. Dr. Rebecca Chun, the attending physician, eventually came out to speak with Sarah. "She's stable now, but she was very close to not making it," Dr. Chun explained. "In addition to the hypothermia, she shows signs of having been living rough for an extended period. There are also some older injuries that suggest she may have experienced trauma at some point." Sarah felt her heart sink. As a social worker, she had seen too many cases of people who had fallen through the cracks of society, often due to circumstances beyond their control. "Has she said anything? Do we know who she is?" "She's been drifting in and out of consciousness, but when she is awake, she seems very disoriented. She hasn't been able to tell us her name or anything about her situation. We're hoping that as she recovers, her memory will clear up. Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives. I'd like to stay, if that's okay, at least until she wakes up properly. She shouldn't be alone. Over the next 3 days, Sarah divided her time between her regular job and sitting by the mysterious woman's bedside. She brought books to read aloud, thinking that familiar voices and stories might help with recovery. She also brought small comforts like lip balm for the woman's chapped lips and soft socks for her feet. On the 3rd day, the woman finally woke up fully. Sarah was reading from a collection of short stories when she noticed the woman's eyes were open and focused. She set the book aside and leaned forward with a gentle smile. "Hi there," Sarah said softly. "How are you feeling?" The woman stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see her struggling to piece together where she was and what had happened. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You're the one who found me." It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded. "Yes, in Lincoln Park. Do you remember anything about how you got there?" The woman's eyes clouded over, and she shook her head slowly. "I remember being cold. So cold. And then, I remember your voice telling me everything would be okay." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "You saved my life. What's your name?" Sarah asked gently. The woman was quiet for so long that Sarah began to worry she had slipped back into confusion. But then, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I think it's Elena. Elena Rodriguez." She looked uncertain, as if she wasn't entirely sure of her own identity. "But everything else is fuzzy. I can't remember how I ended up there, or where I came from before that." Dr. Chun had warned Sarah that memory issues were common in cases of severe hypothermia and trauma. The brain sometimes protected itself by blocking out painful or overwhelming experiences. Sarah reached over and gently squeezed Elena's hand. "That's okay. We'll figure it out together. The important thing right now is that you're safe, and you're getting better." Over the following week, as Elena's physical condition improved, fragments of memory began to return. She remembered being in the military, though she couldn't recall which branch or when she had served. She remembered having skills that seemed unusual for a typical civilian, like being able to assess a room for potential threats within seconds of entering it, or knowing instinctively how to move silently through corridors. Sarah noticed these things too. Despite Elena's apparent vulnerability, there was something about the way she carried herself, even while recovering in a hospital bed, that suggested someone who had been trained for dangerous situations. She was constantly alert, her eyes tracking movement in the hallway, and Sarah had observed her positioning herself in the bed so that she had a clear view of both the door and the window. "Elena," Sarah said one afternoon as they were talking, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but were you in some kind of special forces in the military? You seem to have very particular awareness of your surroundings." Elena looked startled by the question, as if Sarah had touched on something important. She closed her eyes and seemed to be concentrating hard, trying to access memories that remained just out of reach. Yes, I think I was. I have these flashes of training, of being in situations where staying alert meant staying alive. But I can't remember specifics." She opened her eyes and looked directly at Sarah. "Why would I have ended up on the streets with no memory of who I am? What happened to me?" It was a question that haunted both of them. Sarah had contacted the police and various military agencies, but without more concrete information about Elena's full name, service record, or service dates, they had little to go on. Elena Rodriguez was a common name, and there were dozens of women in military databases who could potentially match. As Elena grew stronger, she began to display other skills that reinforced Sarah's suspicion about her military background. She could do complex mental calculations quickly. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of geography that allowed her to identify locations from minimal descriptions, and she had an uncanny ability to read people's body language and intentions. One evening, a fight broke out between 2 visitors in the hallway outside Elena's room. Before the security guards could respond, Elena had assessed the situation and provided Sarah with a detailed analysis of which person had initiated the confrontation, what the likely cause was, and how it would probably resolve. She turned out to be completely accurate on all counts. "How did you know all that?" Sarah asked, amazed. Elena looked troubled. I don't know. It's like I have all these skills and knowledge, but I can't remember learning them or using them. It's like my mind is a library where someone has torn out all the index pages. The breakthrough came on Elena's 10th day in the hospital. Sarah had brought a newspaper to read to her, and as she flipped through the pages, Elena suddenly grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. Wait, Elena said, staring intently at a small news item in the corner of the page. Read that again. The part about the naval exercise. Sarah read the brief article about a training exercise that had taken place off the coast of California several months earlier. As she read, she watched Elena's face change, her expression becoming more focused and intense. I was there, Elena said suddenly. I remember being there. There was an accident during the exercise. A helicopter went down. She pressed her hands to her temples, clearly struggling to access more of the memory. There were people in the water. We had to get to them. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Elena, what exactly do you remember about that day? But Elena had gone pale, and Sarah could see that whatever memory she had just accessed was causing her significant distress. Before Elena could answer, she collapsed back against her pillow, and Sarah called for the nurse. Dr. Chen later explained that traumatic memories often returned in fragments and could be overwhelming for patients who were still in recovery. She recommended that they not push too hard for Elena to remember everything at once, but Sarah could see that Elena was becoming increasingly frustrated with the gaps in her memory. That night, as Sarah sat by Elena's bedside reading, Elena suddenly spoke. Sarah, what if I did something terrible? What if there's a reason I ended up with no memory and no identification? What if people wanted me to disappear? Sarah looked up from her book and saw real fear in Elena's eyes. It was the first time Elena had voiced what Sarah suspected they were both thinking. In all their conversations, they had assumed that Elena was a victim of some kind of accident or misfortune. But what if it was more complicated than that? Elena, Sarah said carefully, whatever happened to you, whatever brought you to that park, I don't believe you did anything terrible. I've spent 10 days getting to know you, and I can see who you are. You're a good person. I'm certain of that. But even as she said the words, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to uncover Elena's story, and that the truth might be more complex and dangerous than either of them was prepared for. The next morning brought a development that would change everything. Dr. Chen came to Elena's room with a serious expression and closed the door behind her. Elena, we've had an inquiry from someone claiming to know you. A man who says he's been looking for you for months. The man who appeared in Elena's hospital room doorway was not what Sarah had expected. She had imagined someone official, perhaps a military representative or a police officer. Instead, she found herself looking at a tall, weathered man in his early 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of manual labor. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, and his gray hair was neatly combed but showed signs of having been worried by nervous fingers. Elena, he said softly, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't immediately place. Mija, is it really you? Elena stared at the man for a long moment, and Sarah could see her struggling to place his face in the fragmented landscape of her memory. Finally, something seemed to click, and tears began streaming down Elena's cheeks. Papa, she whispered. The man crossed the room in 3 quick strides and carefully embraced his daughter, both of them crying openly. Sarah felt her own eyes welling up as she watched the reunion, but she also noticed that Elena still seemed confused and uncertain. I'm sorry, Elena said, pulling back to look at her father's face. I remember you, but everything else is still so unclear. How did you find me? Where have I been? Elena's father, who introduced himself to Sarah as Miguel Rodriguez, sat down heavily in the chair beside Elena's bed. Sarah could see that this conversation was going to be difficult for him. Elena, you disappeared 8 months ago, Miguel began, his voice thick with emotion. One day you were there, and the next day you were gone. The Navy told me there had been an accident during a training exercise, but they couldn't give me details because it was classified. They said you were missing and presumed dead. Elena's face went white. I'm dead. Officially. Miguel nodded grimly. The memorial service was 4 months ago. Your mother, she couldn't handle the uncertainty anymore. She needed closure. He paused and looked at Sarah before continuing. Elena, your mother died 2 months ago. Her heart couldn't take losing you. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah watched as Elena processed this information, her face cycling through expressions of grief, confusion, and something that looked like anger. But, I'm alive, Elena said finally. I'm right here. Why didn't they keep looking for me? Miguel's jaw tightened. I never stopped looking. Even after the official search was called off, even after your mother gave up hope, I kept searching. I hired private investigators. I posted your picture on missing person websites. I contacted every hospital and shelter I could find. When I saw the news story about an unidentified woman being found in Chicago, something told me to follow up. Sarah leaned forward. Mr. Rodriguez, what exactly did the Navy tell you about the accident? Miguel looked uncomfortable. They said it was a training exercise that went wrong. A helicopter crashed into the ocean during a night mission. They recovered the aircraft and most of the crew, but Elena's body was never found. They said the currents in that area were strong, and that. He stopped and looked at his daughter. They said there was little chance anyone could have survived in those waters. Elena was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to piece together memories that remained frustratingly out of reach. Finally, she spoke. I remember being in the water. It was so cold, and there were lights from the rescue boats, but they seemed so far away. She paused, concentrating. But there's something else. Someone was with me in the water. Another person from the crash. Elena, Sarah said gently. You mentioned earlier that you remembered people in the water who needed help. Do you think you might have been trying to save someone else? Elena closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her temples. There was a man, younger than me, maybe mid-20s. He was hurt badly, and he couldn't swim. The current was pulling us away from the rescue boats. Her eyes snapped open. I remember making a choice. I could try to get to the rescue boats myself, or I could try to save him. Miguel reached for Elena's hand. What did you do, Mija? I got him to a piece of debris from the helicopter. Something big enough to keep him afloat. But by the time I made sure he was safe, the rescue boats were too far away. The current had carried us miles from the crash site. Elena's voice was getting stronger as more details came back to her. I tried to signal them, but it was too dark, and the waves were too big. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. How did you survive? How did you get to shore? I don't remember clearly, but I think we drifted for hours before we saw lights from the coast. There was a small beach, rocky and isolated. I managed to get both of us to shore, but the man, he was unconscious by then, hypothermic and injured. Miguel was listening intently. Where was this beach, Elena? Somewhere north of the crash site. Maybe 50 or 60 miles. It wasn't a popular area, no houses or roads nearby. Elena's expression grew troubled. I remember dragging him up onto the sand and trying to keep us both warm until morning. When the sun came up, I could see we were completely alone. What happened next? Sarah asked. Elena was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with memories that remained unclear. I think I want to find help. I left him on the beach and climbed up the cliffs to look for a road or a house or something. But when I got to the top, there was nothing but forest for miles in every direction. Miguel leaned forward. Elena, this is important. Do you remember what happened to the young man? Did you find help for him? Elena's face crumpled. I don't remember. There's this huge gap after that. The next clear memory I have is being in Chicago, living on the streets, with no idea how I got there or who I was. She looked at her father with desperate eyes. Papa, what if he died because I couldn't find help? What if I abandoned him there? You didn't abandon anyone, Miguel said firmly. From what you're describing, you saved his life. Without you, he never would have made it to shore. Dr. Chun, who had been quietly listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. Elena, I think we need to contact the Navy with this information. If there was another survivor from that crash, they need to know. Sarah had been thinking the same thing, but she was also concerned about something else. Elena, you said you remember being in Chicago, living on the streets. How long were you there? And do you remember anything about how you got there? Elena shook her head. Months, I think. Maybe longer. I remember being confused all the time, like I was in a fog. I knew I had skills and knowledge, but I couldn't remember where they came from. I survived by doing odd jobs for cash, sleeping in shelters when I could get a bed. She paused, looking embarrassed. There were times when I thought about ending it all. I felt so lost, so empty. Miguel's face darkened with anger. The Navy declared you dead while you were living on the streets? How is that possible? Dr. Chin spoke up. Severe trauma can sometimes cause amnesia that lasts for months or even years. If Elena was found wandering with no identification and no memory of who she was, she could easily have slipped through the cracks of the system. Over the next few days, Miguel worked with hospital staff and naval authorities to begin the complex process of officially restoring Elena's identity. It turned out to be more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Because Elena had been declared dead, her military records had been sealed, her benefits had been terminated, and her personal effects had been distributed to family members. More importantly, as they dug deeper into the details of the training exercise that had gone wrong, they encountered resistance from naval officials who seemed reluctant to discuss the specifics of what had happened that night. Commander Patricia Hayes, the naval liaison assigned to Elena's case, visited the hospital on Thursday afternoon. She was a stern-faced woman in her 40s who spoke in careful, measured tones that revealed nothing about her personal feelings regarding the situation. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," she said, using Elena's military rank for the first time since the reunion with her father. "We're obviously relieved to learn that you survived the accident. However, your account of events raises some questions that we need to address." Elena, who had been growing stronger and more alert each day, sat up straighter in her hospital bed. Sarah noticed that something about Commander Hayes seemed to put Elena on edge, though she couldn't identify what it was. "What kind of questions?" Elena asked. "You mentioned another survivor from the crash. Our records show that all personnel were accounted for after the accident. Everyone except you." Elena frowned. "I know what I remember. There was definitely another person in the water with me. A young man, injured, couldn't swim on his own." Commander Hayes consulted a tablet she was carrying. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, you were part of a classified training exercise. The details of that mission are still classified, and I'm not authorized to discuss them with civilians present." She glanced meaningfully at Sarah and Miguel. Sarah started to stand up to leave, but Elena grabbed her hand. "They stay," Elena said firmly. "Whatever you need to tell me, they can hear it." Commander Hayes looked uncomfortable. "Lieutenant, this really would be better discussed in private. They saved my life and helped me remember who I am," Elena replied, her voice taking on an authoritative tone that Sarah hadn't heard before. "They stay, or this conversation ends now." After a moment's hesitation, Commander Hayes nodded. "Very well. Lieutenant Rodriguez, you were part of a special operations exercise designed to test new underwater rescue techniques. The mission involved simulating the rescue of personnel from a downed aircraft in hostile waters." Elena nodded slowly. "I remember some of that now. We were testing new equipment, new procedures. The exercise went wrong when the helicopter experienced mechanical failure and went down in rough seas. The official report states that you were thrown clear of the aircraft on impact and were swept away by strong currents before rescue teams could reach you. But what about the other person I remember helping?" Elena insisted. Commander Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, there was no other survivor from that crash. You were the only person unaccounted for." Elena shook her head vigorously. "That's not possible. I know there was someone else. I spent hours keeping him alive in the water." Sarah watched this exchange with growing unease. Something about Commander Hayes's demeanor suggested that she wasn't telling them everything she knew. "Commander," Sarah interjected, "is it possible that Elena rescued someone who wasn't part of the original exercise? Maybe someone from another aircraft or vessel in the area?" Commander Hayes gave Sarah a sharp look. "Ma'am, I understand your concern for Lieutenant Rodriguez, but these matters involve classified information that I cannot discuss with unauthorized personnel." Elena's eyes flashed with anger. "Stop treating me like I'm delusional. I know what I experienced. I saved someone's life, and then I spent months trying to find help for them. If the Navy can't or won't acknowledge that, then maybe there's a reason why." The tension in the room was palpable. Commander Hayes stood up and gathered her papers. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, you've been through a tremendous ordeal, and it's understandable that your memories might be confused or incomplete. We'll continue to investigate your account of events, but, for now, the important thing is your recovery. After Commander Hayes left, Miguel, Sarah, and Elena sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Elena spoke. "She's lying," she said simply. "Or at least, she's not telling us everything she knows." Sarah had to agree. There had been something evasive about the commander's responses, something that suggested she was working from a script rather than simply providing information. "Elena," Miguel said carefully, "what if the person you remember helping wasn't supposed to be there? What if you stumbled into something that the Navy wants to keep quiet?" Elena looked at her father with newfound respect. "You think this goes deeper than just a training accident?" Before Miguel could answer, Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and saw that it was her supervisor from the Social Services Department. She had been taking time off to help Elena, and she needed to check in about her caseload. "I need to take this," she told Elena and Miguel. "I'll be right back." Sarah stepped into the hallway to take the call. As she spoke with her supervisor, she noticed a man in a dark suit standing near the nurse's station. He seemed to be reading something on his phone, but Sarah had the distinct impression that he was actually watching Elena's room. When their eyes met briefly, the man quickly looked away and walked toward the elevator. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The conversation with Commander Hayes had already made her suspicious that there was more to Elena's story than they were being told. Now she was beginning to wonder if Elena might still be in danger. When Sarah returned to the room, she found Elena and Miguel deep in conversation. Elena looked up as Sarah entered. "We've been talking," Elena said. "I need to find out what really happened that night, and I need to know if the person I helped is still alive. If the Navy won't give me answers, I'll have to find them myself." Sarah sat down and looked at both of them seriously. "Elena, there was a man in a suit watching your room just now. When he saw me looking at him, he left quickly." Miguel's expression hardened. "Elena, maybe we should get you out of here. If someone wants to keep you quiet about what you saw or what you know, staying in one place might not be safe." Elena nodded slowly. "You're right, and I think I know where we need to start looking for answers." She looked at Sarah. "You saved my life once already. I hate to ask, but would you be willing to help me one more time?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Of course. What do you need?" Elena's eyes had taken on a determined gleam that reminded Sarah of the Special Forces training Elena was beginning to remember. "I need to get back to that beach where I left him. If he survived, if someone else found him, there might be evidence. And if the Navy is trying to cover something up, that beach might be the key to finding out what really happened." As if to punctuate Elena's words, the lights in the hospital corridor suddenly flickered and went out for several seconds before coming back on. In that brief moment of darkness, Sarah caught sight of two figures standing at the far end of the hallway, watching Elena's room. Sarah realized that their quest for answers was about to become much more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The escape from Chicago General Hospital happened at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, orchestrated with the precision that Elena's returning military training had made possible. Sarah had spent the previous day researching isolated beaches along the Northern California coast, while Miguel gathered supplies and arranged for a rental car under a false name he had used during his years as a private investigator searching for his daughter. Elena had convinced Dr. Chun to discharge her early by demonstrating that her physical recovery was nearly complete and arguing that the hospital environment was becoming psychologically harmful due to the attention from mysterious visitors. What she didn't tell Dr. Chun was that she had noticed the surveillance cameras in her room had been repositioned twice in the past day, and that the same 3 people had walked past her room at precisely 2-hour intervals for the past 48 hours. "The training is coming back," Elena explained to Sarah as they drove through the dark streets of Chicago toward the airport. "Counter-surveillance techniques, threat assessment, operational planning. I was definitely Special Forces, probably Navy SEALs based on the underwater skills I remember." Miguel, who was driving, caught Elena's eyes in the rearview mirror. "Mija, if you were a SEAL, that means you were involved in highly classified operations. That could explain why the Navy is being so secretive about what happened to you." Sarah, who was sitting in the passenger seat with a laptop containing all her research about the California coastline, turned to face Elena. "I think I found the area where you would have washed ashore. Based on the crash site coordinates and the current patterns, there's a stretch of beach about 60 miles north that's completely isolated. It's part of a state preserve, so there's no development, but there are hiking trails that might explain how you eventually made it to civilization. Elena studied the map Sarah had printed out. This looks right. I remember rocky cliffs and a beach that was maybe a quarter-mile long, with dense forest above it. She paused, concentrating on the fragments of memory. There was something else, though? Some kind of structure on the beach. Not natural. Maybe part of an old shipwreck or some kind of military installation. The flight to San Francisco was tense. Elena had insisted they book separate tickets and sit apart from each other, and she had spent the entire trip watching the other passengers with the alert intensity of someone who expected trouble. Sarah noticed that Elena had positioned herself with a clear view of both the aisle and the emergency exits, and that she had identified at least 3 items in the seat pocket that could be used as weapons if necessary. When they landed, Miguel rented a 4-wheel drive vehicle while Elena and Sarah waited in different parts of the airport. Elena had changed her appearance by cutting her hair short and wearing clothing that made her look like a typical tourist rather than a military veteran. But Sarah could see that Elena was constantly scanning their surroundings, looking for threats that might not even exist. The drive north along Highway 1 took them through some of the most beautiful coastal scenery Sarah had ever seen, but she found it difficult to enjoy the views. Elena had become increasingly tense as they approached the area where her memories suggested she had come ashore 8 months earlier. There, Elena said suddenly, as they rounded a curve that offered a view of the ocean. That's it. That's where I came ashore. Miguel pulled into a small parking area that served hikers accessing the coastal preserve. The beach was about a half-mile hike down a steep trail through dense forest, and Elena had warned them that the climb back up would be challenging. As they made their way down the trail, Elena's demeanor changed completely. The uncertainty and confusion that had characterized her during her recovery seemed to fall away, replaced by the focused intensity of someone returning to familiar territory. I remember this trail, she said as they navigated a particularly steep section. I climbed up this exact path looking for help. I was exhausted and hypothermic, but I knew I had to find someone who could help the man I'd left on the beach. When they reached the beach, Sarah immediately understood why this location had been perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. The beach was completely enclosed by high cliffs on both sides, accessible only by the single trail they had just descended. The nearest road was at least 2 miles away, and there were no houses or buildings visible in any direction. Elena stood at the edge of the tree line for several minutes, clearly overwhelmed by returning to the place where her months-long ordeal had begun. Finally, she started walking across the sand toward an area near the northern end of the beach. It was there, she said, pointing to a spot where the beach curved around a large outcropping of rocks. I dragged him up onto the sand right there, and I used driftwood and seaweed to try to make some kind of shelter. Sarah and Miguel followed Elena to the spot she had indicated. Even 8 months later, they could see evidence of human activity. There were pieces of driftwood arranged in a rough windbreak, and Sarah found fragments of what looked like it had once been a military-issue emergency blanket. But it was Miguel who made the discovery that changed everything. Elena, he called out from behind a large piece of driftwood. You need to see this. Elena and Sarah hurried over to where Miguel was kneeling in the sand. He had uncovered what appeared to be a piece of metal, roughly the size of a license plate, with markings that were partially obscured by sand and corrosion. Elena carefully lifted the metal fragment and examined it closely. As she wiped away the sand, numbers and letters became visible. This is from the helicopter, she said with certainty. But this isn't just any piece of debris. This is part of the identification plate that would have contained the aircraft's serial number and mission designation. Sarah looked at the fragment more carefully. Why would you have brought this piece specifically? If you were focused on saving someone's life, why would you have grabbed a piece of debris? Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying the metal plate with intense concentration. Suddenly, her face went pale. I didn't grab this, she said slowly. He had it with him. The person I rescued. He was clutching this when I pulled him out of the water. Miguel frowned. Why would someone be carrying aircraft identification data? Unless he wasn't supposed to be on that helicopter, Elena finished. Unless he was there for reasons that had nothing to do with the training exercise. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Elena, what if you didn't just rescue someone from a training accident? What if you rescued someone who had information that powerful people wanted to keep secret? Elena stood up and began walking around the area where she remembered making the makeshift shelter. After several minutes of searching, she called out excitedly, "There's more here." Sarah and Miguel rushed over to find Elena digging carefully in the sand near a large piece of driftwood. She had uncovered what appeared to be a waterproof bag, the kind used by military personnel to protect sensitive documents and equipment. Elena opened the bag carefully and found that it contained several items that had been protected from the salt water and weather. There was a military identification card for someone named James Patterson, a sergeant in the Army Special Forces. There were also several photographs that appeared to show military personnel in what looked like a covert operation, and a small notebook filled with handwritten notes. "Sarah," Elena said, her voice tight with tension. "James Patterson was reported as having died in a classified operation 6 months before our helicopter crash. According to this ID, he was already supposed to be dead when I pulled him out of the water." Miguel took the notebook and began reading through the handwritten notes. His expression grew increasingly grim as he read. "Elena, these notes describe a plan to eliminate personnel who had knowledge of illegal weapons sales to foreign governments. Patterson wasn't just on your helicopter by accident. He was running from people who wanted him dead, and he had evidence that could bring down high-ranking officials." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "Elena, you didn't just rescue a fellow service member. You rescued a whistleblower who had information that could destroy careers and possibly prevent a war. That's why the Navy lied about there being no other survivors. That's why they declared you dead and stopped looking for you." Elena stared at the identification card in her hands. "If Patterson had evidence of illegal weapons sales, and if I helped him escape, then I'm not just a survivor of an accident. I'm a threat to whoever was involved in the cover-up." As if to confirm her fears, they heard the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Miguel looked up and pointed toward the ocean, where a black helicopter was approaching their location. "We need to get out of here," Elena said, gathering up Patterson's belongings and stuffing them back into the waterproof bag. "If they found us here, then they know we've discovered the truth." The helicopter was getting closer, and Sarah could see that it wasn't marked with any official insignia. Elena's training kicked in completely now, and she began issuing rapid instructions. "Miguel, take Sarah and head back up the trail. Stay low and move fast. When you get to the car, drive to the nearest police station and don't stop for anyone." Sarah grabbed Elena's arm. "What about you? I'm going to buy you time to get away, and I'm going to find out what happened to James Patterson." Elena's voice had taken on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to command situations. "These people have been hunting him for almost a year, and they've been covering up the truth about what happened to both of us. It ends now." Miguel protested. "Elena, I just got you back. I'm not losing you again." Elena hugged her father tightly. "Papa, you're not losing me. But there's a man out there who risked everything to expose corruption and illegal activities. If he's still alive, he needs help. And if he's not, then the people responsible need to be held accountable." The helicopter had landed on the beach about a quarter-mile away, and Sarah could see armed figures disembarking. Elena was right that they needed to move quickly, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to abandon the woman who had become so important to her. "Elena," Sarah said firmly, "I didn't save your life in that park just to watch you sacrifice yourself here. If you're staying to finish this, then I'm staying to help." Elena started to argue, but Sarah cut her off. "You said I saved your life. Well, you saved mine too. Before I found you, I was going through the motions of living without any real purpose. Helping you remember who you are and finding the truth about what happened to you has given my life meaning again. I'm not walking away now." Miguel looked at both women and sighed. "If my daughter inherited her stubbornness from me, then I suppose I inherited it from somewhere too. We stick together." Elena looked like she wanted to argue, but there wasn't time. The figures from the helicopter were moving across the beach toward their location, and they needed to make a decision. "Okay," Elena said finally. "But we do this my way, and everyone follows my lead without question. These people have military training, and they're willing to kill to protect their secrets. We're not going up against weakened warriors here. Over the next hour, Elena demonstrated why she had been selected for Special Forces training. Using the terrain of the beach and cliffs to their advantage, she managed to evade the team that had been sent to capture them, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about their pursuers. From a hidden position among the rocks, they were able to observe the search team and confirm that these were not regular military personnel. They wore no identifying insignia, their equipment was not standard military issue, and their search methods suggested they were more concerned with eliminating witnesses than with gathering information. Private military contractors, Elena explained quietly, probably hired by whoever was behind the weapons sales to clean up loose ends. Sarah was amazed by Elena's transformation. The confused and vulnerable woman she had found in the park had been replaced by someone who moved with deadly efficiency and spoke with the confidence of someone who had faced life-or-death situations many times before. As the sun began to set, Elena put her plan into action. Using skills that were clearly second nature to her, she managed to isolate one of the contractors and obtain information about their mission. What she learned confirmed their worst fears and gave them hope at the same time. James Patterson was still alive. He had been captured shortly after Elena left the beach to find help, but instead of being killed, he had been held in an undisclosed location while his captors tried to locate and retrieve the evidence he had hidden. The contractor Elena interrogated revealed that Patterson had been clever enough to hide multiple caches of evidence in locations that only he knew. More importantly, Patterson had managed to get word to investigative journalists and congressional oversight committees about the weapons sales scheme. The story was going to break within days, which explained why the contractors had finally decided to eliminate both Patterson and Elena. "They're not just trying to silence us," Elena explained to Sarah and Miguel as they prepared for the final phase of her plan. "They're trying to discredit us. If we disappear or die under mysterious circumstances, it will be easier to claim that Patterson's evidence was fabricated." Elena's plan was audacious and risky. She intended to turn the tables on their pursuers by capturing enough evidence to expose not just the weapons sales scheme, but the cover-up that had cost both her and Patterson nearly a year of their lives. Using the waterproof bag they had found on the beach, along with equipment she improvised from materials in their surroundings, Elena managed to document the contractor's presence at the beach and obtain recordings of conversations that implicated high-ranking officials in both the cover-up and the original weapons sales. The confrontation came just before dawn, when the contractors finally located their hiding place among the rocks. But instead of the helpless victims they expected to find, they encountered Elena Rodriguez in full combat mode, supported by two civilians who had proven themselves to be both brave and resourceful. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, 3 contractors were in custody. Their equipment and communications had been secured as evidence, and Elena had managed to establish contact with the FBI agents who had been secretly investigating the weapons sales scheme based on information provided by Patterson. James Patterson was rescued from the remote facility where he had been held captive, and within 48 hours, the story broke simultaneously in 3 major newspapers and 2 television networks. The evidence Patterson had gathered, combined with the materials Elena recovered and the testimony of the captured contractors, led to arrests of officials in both the military and defense industry. Elena Rodriguez was officially restored to life. Her military record was unsealed, and she received recognition for both her original rescue of Patterson and her role in exposing the corruption that had nearly cost both their lives. Sarah returned to Chicago with a new perspective on what it meant to make a difference in someone's life. She had thought she was saving Elena when she found her in Lincoln Park, but she had discovered that Elena had been just as instrumental in saving her. Miguel Rodriguez finally had his daughter back, but more than that, he had the satisfaction of knowing that Elena's months of suffering had ultimately served a purpose larger than any of them had imagined. And Elena herself discovered that sometimes being abandoned to die and forgotten by those in power could provide the perfect opportunity to bring those same people to justice. Her survival had not been just a personal victory, but a victory for everyone who believed that truth and accountability mattered more than protecting institutional secrets. The Navy SEAL had not just lived on. She had lived on to make a difference that would be felt for years to come.